Let me show you what's happening between Israel and Turkey right now, because it tells us something fascinating about how power is shifting in the Middle East. Over here you've got Israel, a country that's spent decades building up its military to defend against threats from its neighbors. And over here you've got Turkey, a NATO member that's now stepping into a role that's making Israel increasingly nervous. But to understand why Israel is so worried about Turkey's moves in Syria, we need to go back and look at how we got here. This whole story really starts with Syria's civil war, which began in 2011. Back then, Syria looked like this, controlled by Bashar al-Assad's regime, backed by Iran and Russia. But by late 2024, everything changed. The Assad regime fell, and in its place a new government emerged, one that's increasingly aligned with Turkey. Now Israel's top security officials are sounding the alarm. They've just released this report, the Nagel Commission report, and it mentions Turkey 15 times. That might not sound like much, but in the language of diplomatic documents, that's actually a big deal. It's telling us that something fundamental is changing in how Israel sees Turkey. Let's zoom in on what's actually happening on the ground. You've got Turkey, positioned here in the north, which has been steadily increasing its influence in Syria. They're not just providing diplomatic support, they're putting boots on the ground, training local forces, and essentially trying to turn Syria into what Israeli officials are calling a client state. This is where things get really interesting. See, for decades, Israel's biggest regional rival has been Iran. They've got this whole network of proxy forces across the Middle East, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. But now, what we're seeing is Turkey potentially setting up its own network of influence, one that could rival both Iran's old system and Israel's regional power. The Israelis are particularly worried about two things. First, there's this area right here, the Syrian-Lebanese border. Israel fears that under the new Turkish-friendly Syrian government, weapons could still flow through here to groups in Lebanon that threaten Israel. And second, there's this region over here in eastern Syria, where the Kurds have carved out a semi-autonomous zone. Turkey has historically seen Kurdish autonomy as a threat, and there's concern they might use their new influence in Syria to crack down on the Kurds, who, by the way, have long had a quiet alliance with Israel. But here's where it gets even more complex. The Israeli government just set up this commission, the Nagel Commission, to figure out what threats they need to prepare for in the next decade. And what they found is pretty striking. They're warning about this scenario where Syrian forces effectively become Turkish proxies. Think about that for a second. This would mean Turkey, a country that technically has diplomatic relations with Israel, could end up with military forces right on Israel's doorstep. This isn't just theoretical. The Commission is so concerned about this that they're recommending Israel increase its defense budget by 15 billion shekels. That's about $4.1 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than some countries' entire military budgets. But there's another layer to this story that we need to talk about. Israel isn't just sitting back and watching this happen, they're making moves of their own. Look over here at the Mediterranean. Israel has been strengthening its ties with Greece and Cyprus, two countries that have historically had tense relations with Turkey. They just signed this massive €2 billion defense deal with Greece. They're selling advanced missile systems to Cyprus. And yet, and this is what makes this situation so fascinating, Israel is also maintaining this really delicate relationship with Azerbaijan, a close ally of Turkey. They sell weapons to Azerbaijan, buy oil from them, and this oil, it flows through Turkey. So you've got this incredibly complex web of relationships where Israel is simultaneously preparing for potential conflict with Turkey, while also maintaining economic ties that depend on Turkish cooperation. Now, all of this is happening against this backdrop of broader changes in the Middle East. Western countries are rushing to build relationships with Syria's new government. France and Germany have already sent their foreign ministers to Damascus. There's this push in Western capitals to remove some Syrian rebel groups from terrorist watch lists. The whole power dynamic of the region is shifting. So what does all this mean? Well, the Israeli government isn't waiting to find out. They're scheduling these high-level meetings, one at the Defense Ministry, another with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They're updating their military planning. They're essentially treating Turkey's moves in Syria as a major strategic shift that could fundamentally change the balance of power in the Middle East. This is really a story about how quickly things can change in this region. Just a few years ago, Turkey was seen as a potential partner in containing Iran's influence. Now, Israel's top security officials are warning about the potential for direct confrontation. It shows us how, in the Middle East, today's partner can become tomorrow's rival, and how the endless quest for regional influence keeps reshaping alliances and creating new threats. What we're watching unfold here isn't just about Israel and Turkey, it's about how power works in the modern Middle East. It's about how countries use proxies and client states to extend their influence. It's about how the fall of one regime, Assad's in this case, can set off this chain reaction that forces everyone else to recalculate their position. The question now is whether this will lead to actual conflict, or if it's just part of the constant repositioning that happens in this region. Israel's security establishment is clearly preparing for the worst, but they're also keeping those diplomatic and economic channels open. It's this delicate balance between preparing for potential conflict while trying to prevent it from actually happening. And that brings us to the bigger question. Is this the beginning of a new chapter in Middle Eastern politics? One where Turkey, not Iran, becomes Israel's main regional rival? Or is this just another shift in the constantly changing landscape of Middle Eastern power politics? The answer to that question isn't just important for Israel and Turkey, it's going to shape the future of the entire region. Remember, this is happening in a part of the world where alliances can shift overnight, where today's enemy can become tomorrow's partner, and where regional powers are constantly competing for influence. What we're seeing between Israel and Turkey right now might just be the beginning of a much bigger transformation in how power works in the Middle East.